Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. Very pleased that you can be with us. Very warm welcome to this climate transparency webinar on the G20 climate finance and green recovery packages in the time of the coronavirus crisis. So my name's Thomas Spencer. I'm a fellow at Energy and Resources Institute in Terry, and Terry.
Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. Apologies for that. It appears that we've lost Thomas Spencer from Terry. He was just welcoming you all to the webinar. Hopefully he'll be able to rejoin us. And hopefully when he does, I can hand back to him. Thanks very much for joining our webinar today. This is the second webinar marking the launch of the Climate Transparency Report for 2020, which was published this time last week. The report itself is available on the Climate Transparency website, and you can engage in a discussion on Twitter using the hashtag CTReport2020. So the idea of the report is that we bring together the most comprehensive review of G20's climate action and the degree to which they're transitioning towards a net zero emissions economy. Climate Transparency itself is a global partnership. It brings together 14 different think tanks and NGOs and a number of experts from across the G20 countries. We have a number of speakers today, and they're going to address the question of how well the G20 are living up to their Paris Agreement commitments, not only to make finance flows consistent with low emission, but also climate resilient development pathways. I can see that Thomas is back. Apologies, I was just finishing up where we were going to be going today, but I can hand back to you just to finish up the last couple of bits of introduction.
No problem, Charlene, and sorry about this. I think you all know that internet connection is a little bit unstable sometimes in India. So just to mention that climate transparency is an international initiative from a large consortium of think tanks and research institutes from around the world. You can see on the slide the partners, the funders. We're very thankful for the funding from Climate Works, European Climate Foundation, World Bank, and German Ministry of Environment, as well as our data partners. So if you could please move on to the next slide, Sebastian. Great, thank you very much. So the way the webinar is going to work, we're going to move very quickly through a lot of very interesting material. My colleague Charlene is going to give a quick introduction with 2 slides before we hand over to David and Enrique for their comments. And the first topic that we will be looking at is G20 efforts to make financial flows consistent with the Paris Agreement. So over to you, Charlene, to present a couple of slides.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. So in 2015, parties to the Paris Agreement committed to make finance flows consistent with low emission and climate resilient development pathways. And this is a commitment that implies that we're not only trying to increase the positive climate finance flows, so encourage climate change adaptation and mitigation, but we're also trying to reduce and redirect the finance flows that are either high carbon or that create more climate vulnerability. It's acknowledged that this is going to require a structural shift in finance flows. And this is away from investments and consumption patterns that are very much incompatible with climate goals. Good examples of this might be continued investment in upstream fossil fuel production or fossil fuel infrastructure. So this long-term goal of the Paris Agreement, it's important to note that this is not a diversion away from the provision of support that developed countries have committed to mobilize for developing country climate action. But instead it acknowledges that the scale of finance and the scale of change that we need to address the climate emergency is significant and applies to all countries. It's been 5 years since these commitments were made, so we need to take stock of where the influential G20 countries are with respect to their progress towards consistency or alignment of the financial flows with the Paris Agreement. Without progress on that, it's going to be very unlikely that we can hold average increase in temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, nor will we be able to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change. So on the next slide, the finance indicators of the Climate Transparency Report look at some of the common policy levers that governments can pull that shift finance flows in a way that can meet climate commitments. These include fiscal policies, such as taxes and subsidies that influence activity through price signals. It includes public finance that lowers costs and risks that encourage private capital to flow to climate action. And finally, we touch on financial policy and regulation in the report that shift behaviors through the rule of law. These can internalize climate-related risks, guide and signal both private and public actors towards climate investment. But back to you, Thomas. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charlene. I'm going to keep the video off so that I don't stretch my bandwidth. So we're now going to look at a really important topic, which is the COVID-19 recovery packages. The public finance response to COVID-19 represents without a doubt the biggest inflow of public finance into the global economy in history, and we have a critical task to make sure that that contributes to climate mitigation and adaptation. So we're going to have our speakers give a quick overview of the greenness of climate of these recovery packages in different countries. I'll start with Charlene, but before I do, we didn't manage in the confusion between my internet going off and Charlene taking over to introduce our two other speakers. So we have David Reifisch from German Watch, the German think tank is team lead for international climate policy, and Enrique Constantinos, who is a senior advisor to the FAN think tank in Argentina. So with that, over to you, Charlene, for an overview of this issue of the COVID recovery package.
Thanks, Thomas. So many of us in the climate community were hoping to see some very positive signals for climate ambition under the UNFCCC process in December 2020. The idea being that countries would submit new, more ambitious nationally determined contributions that signify what climate actions they were taking. So while we have seen a number of positive net zero carbon commitments, particularly in Asia, and good signals that the US will rejoin the Paris Agreement, the annual climate change negotiations of COP26 and many of the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, have also been delayed as a result of the pandemic. And the pandemic has dramatically impacted on economies, and the graphic you can see illustrates that emissions are projected to temporarily drop in 2020. And this data is kindly from Enerdata. A lot of funding has been mobilized to health and social sectors, and this is absolutely necessary to finance the urgent needs in light of the pandemic. When we know that most countries will be poorer, more indebted, with less fiscal space, and it's highly likely they're going to be more regulated and more inward looking as a result. As countries try to get their economies back on track, it's very important to recall the commitments made in Paris. These necessitate that the recovery packages put into place are consistent with climate objectives. The choices that G20 countries make today will have a dramatic impact on the emissions of the future. The Vivid Greenness of Stimulus Index that you can see in the graphic on the right estimates that around 30% of stimulus spending will go to environmentally intensive sectors. This means agriculture, industry, waste, energy, and transport. These are deemed to have the most environmental relevance by the index. The index also shows that too much is going to potentially environmentally damaging sectors. And we can pull out, for example, that 10 of the G20 countries are supporting coal, 10 are supporting the gas sector, 9 are supporting the oil sector, when we're very clear that we must transition away from fossil fuels. 14 of the G20 countries bailed out their airlines without conditionality. It's only France in its bailout of Air France KLM had some emission reduction conditionalities. 7 countries have unconditional support to the automotive industry. Only Germany and France have put any conditions there. More positively, 17 of the G20 countries are providing some support to green industry, and the majority of this is focused on expansion of renewable energy capacity, as well as low emission transport. The commitment that G20 countries have made to the consistency of finance flows with climate objectives means that we have to be very climate conscious where governments put their money. The G20 could reverse progress if the economic recovery from COVID is fossil fuel based, for example. So it's imperative that the recovery measures have climate risks and climate opportunities really baked in. And this we can hopefully see as some of these recovery packages begin to be elaborated and implemented, or we can hopefully see it in some of the new recovery packages that might emerge. They must be carefully linked to environmental conditionality. But I'd like to hand over to David now to talk a little bit more about the Germany recovery package.
Thank you very much, Charlene. Yeah, indeed, I'd like to unfold a little bit the German case. It was one of the first large-scale recovery package that we can deem to a significant degree as green. And it was not without surprise that the climate crisis was taken into account that significantly. Of course, it could have been more transformational, but around 40 billion euros of the entire 130 billion package goes into what we could consider green recovery. And you see that in the slide as well, that shows the vivid greenness of stimulus index. So I would like to highlight especially two elements. One is the transport sector. And there was a strong debate prior to the recovery package. We expected for a long time that we would see a scrapping scheme similar to the one after the financial crisis. But in the end, what we obtained were higher purchasing subsidies for electric and hybrid cars, and significant investment package into charging stations, rail investments, public transport, and R&D for the car industry. That part constitutes the biggest chunk of the investment part of the overall package. Just to give you an idea of the size of the package, I said 40 billion goes roughly into green recovery. The normal German federal budget is of 350 billion. So it's not to be underestimated the amount of finance that goes into green recovery. And an additional 3 billion just last week is going again to the mobility sector with an extension of the EV subsidies until 2025, scrapping premium for all trucks, and an additional funding for R&D. Overall, we can say that's very positive, but we have to know that especially the support for plug-in hybrids has received criticism from civil society due to the fact that tests have shown that in practice, those cars predominantly run on gas rather than electricity. Also, the package is directed towards innovation in the future. I want to highlight especially the additional money for developing a green hydrogen industry and the support for hydrogen import partnerships with specific countries, as well as additional support for climate-friendly shipping investments. On a negative note, you already noticed that, Charlene, the airline bailouts, unfortunately, to the three largest companies, Lufthansa most notably, but also TUI Fly and Condor, went without any conditionalities, unlike the case we saw in France. So that could have been better. But overall, we need to say that the German package can be interpreted as a positive case for green recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Over to you, Enrique.
Thanks, Thomas. And I think it's important to acknowledge as well that we are in a global context, and climate change is a global scale, and we have seen over the last couple of years the challenges that the world face in terms of keeping up with the efforts, the lack of ambition. And this is also being reflected and very much affected by the pandemic this year. This year, under the convention, the UN needed to address the issue of the finance goals. Under the Climate Change Convention and the Paris Agreement, developed countries are the ones that are mandated to support developing countries in their needs to address mitigation and adaptation actions. In this case, actually was in 2009 where the countries agreed to a $100 billion goal per year by 2020. And this year was that year. We are now in a delay negotiation process, and this is something that we'll have to see how it's developed in next year and during the COP in Glasgow. Moreover, the Paris Agreement not only talks about the 100 billion goal for 2020, but it says that this has to be maintained until 2025. So negotiations have to start already to talk about what the new goal after 2025 will be. And in this case, it is important to note that many countries, many Annex II countries, which 8 of them are from the G20, they reported some support of 43 billion the US dollars between 2017 and 2018. This is something that is almost 50% increase compared to what was given in between 2015 and 2016. This is clearly not enough at this point, but is something that has been developed over the time. This last couple of years, with the challenges in the US and with the challenges in the global scale, this is something that needs to be addressed, and this is something that hopefully will change towards next year. But the attention needs to be put in there, because the Green Climate Fund has been dispersing many funds to adaptation and mitigation in developing countries, but the transformational changes that we need a lot more, and this is key, a crucial element for the transition that we need.
Thank you very much, Enrique. I'll just ask the team at Climate Transparency to change to the next slide for the next section of the webinar. Great. So obviously public funding is one issue, and we have seen a huge surge in public funding as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. But the issue of underlying incentives across the whole economy is also crucial. So for the next 2 sections of the webinar, we are going to look at the issue of fossil fuel subsidies and then carbon pricing as 2 crucial measures that influence investment decisions across the whole economy. So I'm going to hand over to Charlene now to present how fossil fuel subsidies have evolved in the G20 countries over the last few years. So over to you, Charlene.
Thanks, Thomas. The Climate Transparency Report highlights that in 2019, the year for which we have latest data, the G20 countries directed at least $130 billion in subsidies to coal, oil, and gas. And this represents an increase on the 2018 period, and this is despite commitments of the G20 to phase out these kind of subsidies. The official wording is to rationalize and phase out over the medium term inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption. It's a shame that we don't see more strict timelines and more plans for phase out, and that is what we'd ideally like to push towards. On the next slide, you can see that the numbers that we have this year are a decrease on the 10-year high of 230 billion in 2013. It should be noted, however, that these comparisons of fossil fuel subsidies over time are incredibly complicated, and they're complicated by the price of fossil fuels themselves. So a lot of the general decline that you see in subsidies provided to oil and gas since 2013 is in large part due to quite a dramatic fall in oil prices. And it's not just a result of shifts in fiscal policy. More positively, we do have progress that's been made in Brazil, Canada, Italy, and Indonesia. And I'd urge you to look at the country profiles where you can read why those changes have happened. In all of the G20 member states, except in Germany, the largest subsidies were directed towards petroleum as opposed to coal, natural gas, or electricity. What's very interesting that in Germany, where there's a lot of coal subsidies, these are actually being used in support of the just transition in their coal phase out. And this is a highly important context because we know that successful fossil fuel subsidy reform will really depend on that effective inclusion of socioeconomic considerations, as well as, of course, robust regulation relating to the transparency of accounting and some hard targets. I'd like to pass over to Enrique, who can talk from reality as the situation in Argentina unfolds with respect to fossil fuels.
Thanks, Charlene. Indeed, fossil fuel subsidies in Argentina is a big challenge. Well, in the last couple of years, we have seen how fossil fuel subsidies have been in decrease in line with the G20. We still see that they represent a really large part of the incentives that we are seeing, especially this year, which was a very challenging year. This year only, Argentina dedicated 1% of its GDP of the national budget, for fossil fuel subsidies, and this is tremendous amount of money towards the private sector, towards the production and consumption of fossil fuel subsidies. This even represents 4 times what was dedicated for fighting the coronavirus crisis in our country, which is an alarming number. And moreover, this is the government early in the year dedicated a particular agreements to fix the price of the oil despite the changes in the international market. We have seen at the beginning of the year how the price of oil was changing very dramatically with a lot of volatility. At some point, well, Argentina decided to ensure a fixed price for the producers. And this is something that is clearly damaging the transition. There were some efforts in terms of renewable energy and some incentives, but these steps that we're taking are not actually in the right direction and have not, and we don't see much of this changes in the near future. Sometimes, and with the excuse of the pandemic and the crisis and the jobs and the families, the government is trying to maintain the status quo, at least for now.
Thank you, Enrique. So now we will look at the flip side of the subsidy question, which is carbon pricing, another crucial measure to direct financial flows. So I will hand over again to Charlene to give you the findings of the report.
Thanks a lot. So, governments can very importantly influence the spending of others, and carbon pricing is a really good tool through which they do that. All but India and Australia have or are considering explicit carbon pricing schemes. That's 18 of the G20 countries. Mexico's new start to its national carbon market, the pilot phase, is important in this regard. Of course, the detail counts. Most schemes have carbon prices that are below that might be required to align with Paris or have insufficient emissions coverage. So there's still work to be done. The report itself actually goes into carbon revenues as well. These is really important because it also helps us to identify the revenues that could be redistributed, either to protect those most vulnerable to climate change or from the transition impacts. So it could boost, for example, social safety nets or be used for training schemes. Maybe I can go straight on to how governments also influence through financial policy and regulation, which is a new and emerging field for climate change. And this is just another way that governments can influence spending that's reported in our 2020 report. So this captures the actions of a number of institutions that are public and quasi-public, so finance ministries through central banks and financial regulators. And this really recognizes that climate change is a material risk that poses a risk to the stability of the economy and the financial system. So the G20 action so far largely relates to these actors' role in providing a signal of future direction, guidance on what is consistent or what is Paris compatible. So I urge you to look in more detail at the Climate Transparency Report itself that goes through which countries are introducing green finance taxonomies, green bond principles, or even going further into stress testing and climate risk disclosure in financial reporting. But I'd like to give the floor to David to just talk very briefly about how the financial sector is responding.
Thank you, Charlene. Yeah, we can say to a varying degree. I mean, we notice the significant uptake of 2050 climate neutrality targets by financial sector actors. But what we need to see in that regard more is to put meat to the bone. Especially, we have seen that several banks that have put out announcements over the past year or the past 2 years have at the same time ramped up their financing of fossil fuels overall. That is mostly banks from the US, Canada, and China. So it's key that the words will be put into action. And I want to highlight just a couple of examples that are very positive. It's the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance that has really set out their target setting protocol out to the public for consultation. Similarly, the International Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change with their net zero investment framework, and the growing support for TCFD is also absolutely noteworthy. Maybe I want to always also say that we have to know that the financial sector does not act in isolation. So for the financial sector to transform, it comes into the interaction with the real economy, and the financial sector will depend on the real economy also to make data available so that the financial sector can transform their investments and portfolio. I want to, as a last point, get to the European context where we are at a crucial point in time where the delegated acts for the EU taxonomy were published for consultation. And it is crucial that those delegated acts will go through shortly and in the way that they are close to the way they were proposed by the technical expert group, because the taxonomy should be a science-based taxonomy. And the private sector really relies on the taxonomy to go through, because as of the reporting for next year's business year, they will need to take the taxonomy into account.
Thank you, David. So that brings us to the end of the presentation from the speakers. I would like to encourage all the participants to send any questions in by the chat, and I will direct them to the appropriate speaker. We're coming up towards the end of the time, but I think we could maybe go 5 minutes over time to have the chance for some Q&A. I'll kick things off. Maybe I'll just ask a question to Charlene. You know, the Climate Transparency Report looks across a lot of different indicators for the effort to redirect financial flows, from public spending to subsidies to carbon pricing to policies and regulation. Could you give us a little bit of a sense of what you see as sort of best practice emerging out of this, and some of the pitfalls, the key things that countries are not doing among this policy menu?
Thanks, Thomas. I think, you know, we still have a long way to go. I think the Climate Transparency Report has been great in pulling it all together in a narrative about what governments can do. What are the things that governments can do? And we can see, and David has mentioned, that the private sector itself is also kind of picking up steam and doing things autonomously. In terms of what governments could do more, I think fiscal policy is a huge part of this equation. So we know that financial policy and regulation, the role of the central banks is emerging as very important, and particularly in a kind of a post-coronavirus kind of world, we need them, and we need them to support with shifting from rescue packages to recovery packages, and the role that kind of goes between financial policy and regulation and fiscal policy and the links between those two. Fiscal policies, particularly around fossil fuel subsidies, that's a big one. We're seeing huge declines in renewable energy prices. So we need to see much clearer and more stringent rules on how to kind of phase out fossil fuel subsidies. We can go beyond coal, and we can start thinking about oil and start thinking about gas as well. I'm not saying that we have to phase them out immediately, particularly in all countries, given the differentiated responsibilities of countries. But we do need to start making plans for those, and that's hopefully where we can see more ambition. Perhaps I'll stop there and give someone else a chance to talk. Thanks.
Sure. I think what we are realizing is the need for multiple policies across different parts of the financial sector. I think you brought that across really well. David, I have a question for you. You mentioned the EU taxonomy on different sectors and different instruments. Here in India, the Reserve Bank of India has been discussing something similar, although it's not really moved forward as yet. But I think it could be really critical to directing investments in a country like India. So could you say a few words about the process of developing the taxonomy and how you could see that being applied in other countries, whether you think you can just copy and paste the taxonomy or whether it needs to be adjusted for different country circumstances? I think this would be really interesting for our listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you, Thomas. I want to highlight especially the technical expert group that I mentioned really in the end. that has put a lot of upfront work into developing the individual thresholds for the different technologies to determine what is green. Important to say also not just what is green, but what are technologies that are important for the transition. And they have done a lot of upfront work that can be used also by other countries. Overall, I believe that the private sector, the financial sector is interested in using ideally a single global standard, so that the EU taxonomy, being the first in that regard, could set really the baseline for other countries. And then, of course, as you mentioned, India, it might be adjusted and twisted for the national purposes. But overall, I see value that, for example, in the G20 context, the different countries come together based on the EU taxonomy, find a global standard for what are green and transitional investments that are aligned with the Paris Agreement.
Right. So maybe in the future, we'll have to include an indicator on applying some kind of taxonomy. So Enrique, I'd like to ask you a question about the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. And then I'm going to turn over to Charlene to ask a question that has come in on the chat. But my question to you, Enrique, goes to the issue of the political economy of fossil fuel phase out. We've seen in other countries that phasing out fossil fuel subsidies has caused a lot of social backlash, if not done well, and if there are no efforts to compensate poor households and so on. So I just wanted to get your sense from a country like Argentina, which still has a high subsidy burden, as you mentioned. What could be done to make the phase down of fossil fuel subsidies more socially acceptable?
That is a great question, Thomas. I think that coming from a developing country like Argentina, an emerging economy, if you want it, we have a very mixed situation in our society. We are a G20 country. We are one of the three largest economies in Latin America, but we still have a lot of challenges when it comes to social well-being. And in the last couple of years, the amount of people below the poverty line has raised. So this all becomes a big challenge when you are talking about removing these incentives or things that makes some goods accessible. I think that the balance in countries like ours is always important. If you are going to remove fossil fuel subsidies, which in some cases benefit people, make accessible energy to some people, you need to provide solutions or alternatives. You cannot just remove the subsidies and leave people to solve the issues by their own. You need to provide alternatives. You need to make something else accessible. And this is the challenge that we face here. If we will make fossil fuels more expensive, let's say, we need to provide alternatives. We need to make more accessible renewable energy or energy efficiency, reduce the amount of energy we consume. And when it comes to the development of these policies, I think that this is very important that you keep a balance, because we always do this work, and we, as the Climate Transparency Report states as well, this is all within the framework of a just transition. This is important to keep in mind to make sure that this transition can actually move away from the incentives to the fossil fuel industry towards the renewable energy or other sources or other benefits. In Argentina or in other countries, you can use the money for fossil that you're currently using for fossil fuel subsidies and direct it to other social benefits that are much needed.
Yeah, I think the framing of just transition also links well to the next question, which is regarding adaptation and resilience, because that is also a question of just transition. So Charlene, do you want to give us some insights into what the COVID recovery packages have been saying regarding adaptation and resilience?
Thanks, and thanks a lot for the question, Smiran. It's a very, very interesting question, and one I'm really glad you raised, because it's an incredibly challenging issue to get into. And I think part of the problem is that we are able to use a metric through which we can consider mitigation and through which we can compare the G20 countries. And it's incredibly challenging to try and do this for adaptation. And climate transparency itself went through a strong process of trying to see what indicators we could have, financial indicators that we could have that could try to pick up some adaptation action and look at the comparability between that. And it's incredibly challenging given how country specific the adaptation challenges are. And I think also, you know, the other thing that we're struggling with in order to identify adaptation is that there's a strong linkage with development. So in a lot of the recovery packages, you would struggle to find kind of adaptation explicitly titled within it. But what we are seeing is some focus in some countries on, for example, sustainable land use, sustainable agriculture, and some kind of job training and job packages. But I think we'd need to go beyond that. We need to look beyond what are the kind of the recovery packages that are trying to support environmental goods, nature-based solutions. And we'd have to start thinking about, well, you know, COVID showed us just how vulnerable we are to shocks. Climate change is going to be one of those shocks. What can we do that reduces our vulnerability at a much more structural level? So in that case, we can see a number of the, say, for example, social safety nets, minimum income schemes. All of these will increase our ability to adapt to climate change. So it's unfortunately, I'm not strongly able to answer your question because a lot of recovery packages haven't articulated adaptation in that way. But I wanted to answer you because I think it's a really very, very important question. And it's important that we all pay attention to this and try to look at how the response package actually builds our resilience to future shocks, inclusive of climate change. And it further emphasizes this difficulty of trying to unpack vulnerability and looking at all the socioeconomic considerations within that. Thanks, Thomas.
All right, thanks very much. So we've run a little bit over time, but there was a lot to unpack, and I think half an hour was always ambitious. So let me end by thanking all of the panelists and Climate Transparency for putting together this short webinar, but more importantly for thanking the participants for coming. I think there's two or three things that I take away from this. The first is the need for comprehensive policies across the financial sector to redirect investments. Additional public budgetary funding is not enough. You also need to look at incentives across the economy, from carbon pricing to fossil fuel subsidies to financial regulation. And the second picture that emerges is that although a lot of progress has been made, I think looking back 10 years ago, if we had thought that central banks would be discussing climate change on a daily basis, we would have said we would be doing very well. And this is the case today, but we still have a long way to go. And I think the COVID recovery packages provide a great opportunity for that. The third message is that although there are some green shoots in these recovery packages, there is a lot of funding for the fossil fuel industry and for existing economic high carbon activities. And this is concerning. But obviously, there's still a little bit of time, and we can try and shape these packages as much as possible as they get implemented, because announcement is one thing, implementation over the coming months and years is another. Just to close, to say that Climate Transparency has another webinar looking at this year's report on the 2nd of December, I should say, looking at the decarbonisation of the power sector and what progress is being made in this regard in the G20 countries. So really critical issue. I hope you can join for that. And until then, thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you again at another Climate Transparency webinar. Thank you. Thank you, David, Charlene, Enrique.